Sorry, everybody, who's on the recording. We just started, but we're just in this first verse of chapter 12, and we're talking about the great cloud of witnesses, those martyrs who went before us, who are witnesses of God's faithfulness, but also witnesses of their own faith. Yeah, Anne, go ahead. So the imagery of a cloud.
Well, it's not formed. It's flexible. I just think that's an interesting choice of words instead of something more concrete, like the group of witnesses or the crowd of witnesses.
So where else have you heard the image of cloud in the Bible?
Jesus is sometimes propelled on clouds.
Well, he ascends up into heaven on clouds. That's right. But think Old Testament. Think towards the end of this chapter, we're going to get some imagery of Mount Zion and so forth, and the wilderness period.
Well, God was the pillar of cloud.
Right. Pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. And so the imagery, yeah, Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to say the cloud in the Exodus story.
Yeah, and what did that, God, this representation of a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, and I have to add a story. So we lived north of Lake Pontchartrain for 6 years. So at the time it was the longest overwater bridge, 26.5 miles. I drove it every day to work, 60 some miles total. And one day there was just a big, massive storm coming across the lake from the west. And I saw this deep, long, columnar cloud, and lightning was flashing inside it, all the way up and down it. I have never since and never before seen anything like it, but it immediately took me to that passage in Exodus with this imagery of this pillar of cloud going before the Israelites. So what does all that evoke? You put these together. I mean, why is the cloud there in the first place in Exodus?
The presence of God.
It's
Right.
to guide the people.
Yeah, tell them when to go, not to go.
Yes, all of that. Exactly right. It was leading them. It was the presence of God with them. It was a reminder. It did stop, and you're absolutely right. It would stop and start. That's how they knew when to get up and go and so forth. And it was with them. And this word surrounded, we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. I've commented before about my good Protestant upbringing, this notion of saints and the departed being with us and so forth always made my Presbyterian family very antsy, and really I should say anti-Catholic family, to be completely blunt about it, because Presbyterianism and Calvinist traditions don't preclude the understanding of these great witnesses. But this notion that they are still somehow around and with us, encouraging us, right? And sort of like that pillar of cloud that was God's being with Israel. So I think, Anne, I think you're right that the image of cloud is very powerful and intentional here. It could have said assembly. Later we have this word assembly of the angels, which would be congregation, kanishta, but instead it's a synagogue. Instead it's cloud.
So the Christians are not in a solitary existence. They're surrounded not only by God, but all of the people who have gone before.
Yeah, and I'm guessing, Mac, you probably preached once or twice. I've certainly heard great sermons about the reminder that no matter how small our congregation may become on any given Sunday, it is all those who've gone before, not just at Good Shepherd, but all those of faith who've gone before. Good.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let us lay aside every weight. And now notice the also, gar, I think is the Greek, if I remember correctly. Let us also lay aside every weight in the sin that clings so closely. Grammatically, I read this as a reference back to these martyrs, right? As they set it aside, there is an unencumbering of a recognition that I'm going to just focus on this commitment of faith. It's interesting, Elizabeth and I on the way down and back yesterday read a book or had an Audible book. It's very popular right now, called 4,000 Weeks. And it says its subtitle is a time management book for mortals, but it's actually really a philosophical work. It begins with the statement that we all will die. And that, if the average life expectancy is 80 years, that's 4,000 weeks. It's not a lot of weeks. And they even reflect on the fact that as we get older, those weeks seem to pass much more rapidly. And there was actually some interesting psychological discussion about why that is, and so forth and so on. And but one of the main themes, it's not really about time management in a productivity kind of sense, even though that's where this guy came from. He really does much more philosophical work now. He's a Brit, a Cambridge grad who lives in New York City. Oliver something, starts with a B. But one of the major things he talks about is it's the anxiety and the overwhelming pressures and things that we feel that keep us from doing those things that we most want to do. And one key element, and it's very secular. He talked about his grandmother who was Jewish, and he talks about a lot about various Eastern or American Eastern mystics and things like that. But one of the fundamental things he talks about is the fact that in all these various strands and traditions is if we but recognize how finite our time is, if we but recognize how limited our abilities are always going to be, that is not admitting defeat, but acknowledging the reality that then frees us up and allows us to go forward. So the connection here, I think, is the preacher is saying, look, these martyrs, these witnesses, recognized that their time was completely short, and so they had to set aside everything but the faith. And while that seems paradoxical, that wouldn't you think that the threat of torturous death would be the greatest weight that you could possibly take on? What the preacher is implying instead is that it's actually incredibly liberating to face that mortality, because you're facing that mortality through the lens of faith and eternal life. Well, I've never been. Yeah, go ahead, Kathy.
Like the psalmist said, teach me to number my days.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot more to be said, I suppose, and written about the fact that we are so, and he actually this author delves a little bit into the way in which certain Christian traditions, by emphasizing the resurrection and eternal life, diminish and devalue this life, which I don't think is what the preacher's doing here in Hebrews. And I think that's, as you said, Kathy, that's not what the psalmist is saying, for the value of it and to experience what we can in it. And we'll see in a minute how we move in faith.
And
so he points this again. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, see ourselves from God's perspective.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
And they might be talking here, I can't really tell, to be honest, but the preacher might be talking about the fact that because they were willing to give up their lives for their faith, that's a kind of weight, the weight of, I guess, self-preservation or whatever you want to call it. They threw that out of the boat, and and maybe that is considered a sin. I don't know. But they obviously valued God and their faith in God more than their lives.
Yeah, no, exactly right. And I don't think that's not the sin that they're talking about. I think the sin here, the preacher would be the sin of, well, it could be any number of things. But in the context of this great cloud of witnesses, i.e. the martyrs, which is what witness means, that they're laying aside all those things, including whatever sin it is, to run with perseverance, so that there's nothing encumbering, there's nothing holding them back in this pursuit. Of course, Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. I mean, it is amazing, really, when you think about how many terms and phrases we use in our liturgy that come from Hebrews. And as we said right at the beginning of the study, how rarely we actually seem to study and preach from it. But again, one of the things that's been really startling for me in going through this again, teaching in a church context now and not in a secular context, is the way in which I'm more and more convinced that the preacher here is really laying out our creed for us, not in the formulation that would come a couple hundred years later, but still those elements nonetheless. And we'll see this here. So he's the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. He's made that perfect, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken a seat at the right hand of the throne of God. And we don't need to, I don't want to belabor things for you, but we could, of course, go through almost every bit and clause here. But are there particular words or phrases here that would stick out to you?
I like pioneer.
It reminds me of the Presbyterian notion of Jesus is the first in everything, and baptism, and sets the example in the way he lived and ministered, and the way he died, and then the way he's resurrected.
Yeah, excellent, Amy. And in particular, although the baptism notion is always one that I have to, now that I have a fuller context of Judaism at the time, but you're absolutely right. This is what the preacher is saying here. This notion, Kathy, of pioneer, that he's the first one to go through all of this, meaning he's paved the way for us, right? And we're not going it alone.
Yeah, we're following.
Like he's the second Adam, and
yeah,
I like
exactly
those references.
He's enabled us to even be.
Is that Romans? Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like Romans.
Yeah, so so pioneer, he's the one who goes before us, the perfecter of our faith. I honestly, I can't tell you I know exactly what the preacher has in mind here. To my mind, and this is acknowledging my prejudices and predilections, I think some of that, given the context of Hebrews and the discussion of the law, I think some of that has to be the fact that we are a part of this larger faith that goes all the way back to creation, through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, through Sinai. We don't need those sacrifices being offered anymore. That's my hunch as to what that means, perfecter of faith, but I'm not exactly sure.
When I read that, I think of it as he who made it possible for us to be saved. That he made it possible. And I guess that's true of the pioneer too, actually.
Well, but there's remember the old computer game? Some of you might remember the old computer game, the Oregon Trail. Everybody died of dysentery on the way out.
Yeah.
And I've not visited and seen, but apparently in the West, you can still see some of these these wheel ruts, these deep lines from these wagon wheels. Suppose if you used an image like that, Jesus both went first on that trail, but then also laid down an 8-lane highway for us all. That's sort of the perfecting of the faith, is making that path clear for us. I don't know if that metaphor and image really works, or if it really connects with what the preacher means, but
still nice.
Somehow I think that's a contemporary Christian song in the making. Yeah, Mac?
I sort of get lost a little bit in this word joy here. I think I know what it means, but it doesn't really jump out at me either.
Yeah, so what do you think it is, Mac? I was going to ask about that.
I think the only thing that I can see is he was able to look through all of that which he knew was coming to see what the end result would be.
Yeah, that's my first thought. It also occurs to me, and again, this may be me bringing other things from the New Testament around, and we're reading John and so forth, but also the joy of completing the work that the Father has given him,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps.
Yeah.
But yeah, I certainly think, that without a doubt, the preacher, you're right, I think is pushing us towards this longer vision of the final work of where things are, so we don't get stuck in this moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
It might be the joy of obedience.
Yeah, that's sort of what I was thinking. Sorry, I thought I saw an animal down there. Yeah, joy of obedience. That's what I was kind of thinking, Kathy, as well. And maybe there's a path to keep extending that metaphor, I suppose. Again, the preacher is trying to encourage a community that's feeling that they're in deep persecution.
Mhm.
He's trying to encourage them to remain faithful. And so perhaps what he's trying to articulate is, look, Jesus showed us the way to do this. Focus on the joy that is ultimately there, so that you may endure even the cross, even the shame. And then we're going to get into some co-heir type language, being adopted into the family, that he's our father too kind of language. So perhaps that's part of it.
I always thought that for the sake of the joy that was set before him was a reference to a lot of different things, but one of them was that he was returning to full communion with the Father out of his human self, having finished his human journey, and also that the joy that there was going to be in again the Presbyterian notion of the great banquet, or however the phrases you want to use.
That comes later in this chapter,
Mhm.
Amy. That's wholly appropriate. Yeah.
That we'll sit down and have wine together. With,
yeah. Or my dad would say grape juice. But,
oh dear, no,
yeah. Good. Well, and this real eschatological image has taken a seat at the right hand of the throne of God. I mean, this image, and you'll recall back towards the beginning of our sermon of Hebrews, the book, and the reference to the psalm, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, and I'll make your enemies your footstool, and so forth. So it's all these elements are here in Hebrews.
Mhm.
Right, we got a lot more verses to get through. So so that you may not grow weary or lose heart. So again, this whole chapter is trying to put a bow on, or really bring to a crescendo all of this language of exhortation and encouragement. So consider him, Jesus, who endured such hostility against himself for sinners, so that you may not grow weary or lose heart. I'm not trying to make you feel horrible about yourself because of all this amazing stuff Jesus did. I'm trying to encourage you. I want you to not lose heart or grow weary. Jesus went before. You can do this too. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood, and you have forgotten the exhortation that addresses you. So verse 5 is going to shift it a little bit. So again, this is all in the language of exhortation. It's this reminder that we are to be Christ-like, and yet we are not the Christ. We can't take away other people's sins, but he gives us this model and encouragement. I'm not sure in verse 4, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. I've always assumed, I've always sort of taken that as an assumption of, you've not been martyred, you've not been tortured or anything like that. But when I read it again, I realize, well, that may still be maybe the reading, but I'm also wondering if this is if sin is external to ourselves, right? If it's the sin of persecution, right? Persecuting the followers of God would be sinful, then it would be that. But I also wonder about the internal struggles. Jesus sweats drops of blood when he's in the garden wrestling with, it's not explicit, but it seems that part of what he's wrestling with is just submitting himself to God and allowing himself to go to trial and go to the cross. He knows what's coming. So I don't know if that's what the author might have in mind, but it did occur to me this morning when rereading it in a way that I hadn't thought about it.
I don't know why, but verse 4 always reminds me of the Garden of Gethsemane. I think it's just the struggle that he's talking about when considering Jesus and his struggle and comparing our own.
Yeah, that only just occurred to me, to be honest with you. Oops, pardon me. I don't know why it's not. There we go. Okay. So thank you, Amy. Yeah, it really had just occurred to me. So verse 5 and the next couple of verses move to this language again. He's trying to, in my view, the preacher's trying to balance this out. He's trying to be really strong. The stakes are high, so be firm. And now he's shifting a little bit. And again, because I talked about this in the book, these are some passages that can often be, in my view, misused around suffering, discussing suffering. But he says you have forgotten, and because you're getting anxious and you're viewing the persecution, the struggles and the difficulties you are experiencing are causing you to begin to lack your faith. And what he's going to pivot here on verse 5 is basically to say, this is evidence of your faith. You have forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as children. So Proverbs often used as children. We know within Judaism of the time, and even to this day in Orthodox Judaism, Proverbs is sort of a staple text for rearing up of children. That's why it was written, and not just children, but there are specific elements to it. And here from chapter 3, my child, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, or lose heart when you are punished by him. For the Lord disciplines those whom he loves and chastises every child whom he accepts. And so I can't remember if I put this in the book, but I do remember when I was in college, we were in a Bible study, and I remember exactly who it was who said it, and we're still friends, and this is recorded, so I won't say her name. But she said, somebody was going through, just feeling attacked, just everything was going wrong in their life. They were depressed and down and frustrated. Something was going on with classes and then something with family. And trying to be encouraging, this person, invoking Proverbs and Hebrews, said, well, you must be doing something right in serving God because these things are happening. This is a sign of God's love and direction, but missed out the discipline aspect of it, right? You could be having difficulty in your family because you're not being a good child, or maybe you are. Maybe you're holding firm to a witness. We had one friend who came from a Jewish family, and her family disowned her when she became a Christian. But it's so we have to we can't be simple or simplistic with with how we understand this passage. But it's clear that the preacher is trying to say, look at these things that you are going through as discipline, as chastisement, and then carries on, endure trials for the sake of discipline. And so all of this hardship, he's saying, understand this as a moment for you to accept God's redirection of you, a call to faithfulness, a call to perseverance. And here's the fundamental thing, and this is why, God is treating you as children, as in you are God's children. For what child is there whom a parent does not discipline, right? so when I was working on Lamentations with my doctorate, there were a couple of modern scholars who tried to argue, because you gotta try and write your dissertation on something, right? They try to argue that Lamentations is really an ancient statement of atheism, that this is an ancient Israelite or more than one beginning to express that there is no God because of the frank and open anger being expressed towards God. And I've always maintained that you don't get angry with someone who you don't care about or believe doesn't exist, right? You know, we might get angry. Some random person makes a comment or says something about us. Our pride might be wounded. We may want people to know that that's not true about us, but that's all about our pride and how we are. It's not really about the relationship. But if Elizabeth wounds me, I want a relationship with Elizabeth, or I wound her. That engagement, I care about that. But if I didn't care about her anymore, I wouldn't care about what happens. So the argument here is the very fact that you are in the midst of these trials is evidence that you are God's children, and it is discipline. But discipline only occurs when God cares for you, when the parent cares for the child. If you do not have that discipline in which all children share, then you are illegitimate and not his children. So he extends this metaphor here. But what are your thoughts on that? Like I said, I think some people take this and expand it out to all suffering and hardship and trials that we might experience as Christians, and I don't think that's the case. Not all hardship and suffering, obviously, I don't think is God disciplining us in some way. But what do you make of this? Well, I think this so like I said, the adoption aspect, that we are to consider God our Father as well. I mean, I went through a period where I thought that it was truly remarkable that Jesus called God his Father, and it is clear it's not common language, because the Gospels make it clear it causes some consternation, right? But Kathy's been pointing out various Psalms, and the Psalms often have this sort of language. And what the preacher is saying is that this applies to us now too. And so I don't know that I would necessarily assert as firmly as I would have in the past that that's a revolutionary sort of thing. But it's clear that the preacher is saying, be encouraged and know that you are loved by the Father, and that the stakes are bigger and better than any stakes your earthly parent can have. So, you know, I think of Jesus saying, what earthly father, if their child asks for bread, would give them a stone, and asks for fish, gives them a snake? Is that right? I think I'm remembering it correctly. So that's the same sort of imagery being invoked.
All the way through this, I keep hearing that he is talking to a congregation who is about to fall away from the faith. Much like, I think it's Michael White who says that the Gospel of Mark is written to a congregation who is in essentially the same kind of situation, falling away, and so he's writing encouragement.
Yep. Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Mac. And one of the things that we have to remember in reading this and receiving is both that context, but also recognizing that it's okay if it doesn't quite hit home to us because we weren't the original audience, or maybe it doesn't hit home to us right now. But just because this language sometimes doesn't work for us doesn't mean that it's still not valid encouragement. Am I making sense?
Yeah,
I guess.
I think you're exactly right with that, because all of us can pull out of this something, but to recognize that this speaks particularly, or should speak particularly, to people who are either personally or as a congregation about to give up hope.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what I liked about verses 12 and 13 that I've highlighted, maybe I should have used a different color, is there's a shift in tone, or at least I hear it as a shift in tone with the preacher, in that he's talking about what God is doing to us, what we are experiencing, receiving as trials, and be patient and so forth. And there's an action in perseverance, there's an action in patience, but in many ways that action is inaction, i.e., don't move from where you are in your position of faith. Don't leave the church. But in verse 12, he shifts into much more active verbs for us. Therefore, lift your drooping hands, strengthen your weak knees, make straight the paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. So it's not even a question of not be put out of joint, but be healed. And I really liked this shift of putting responsibility back into the congregation's hands, into our hands, of understanding that this is not just us passively receiving God's love and going, great, okay, I'm going to hold on to that and I'm just not going to let go of it. There's work to be done, right? That there is activity for us in our faith. I don't know. I guess maybe because I like to do something other than just waiting, which is part of what that book about time and there's a whole chapter on patience, which Elizabeth and I were both laughing about. That whole chapter on patience, just as the tire blew, and we then had 4.5 hours in the middle of the night waiting for the tow truck. But so I think that there is this shift in tone that I at least found sort of encouraging and challenging too. So it's, any other thoughts in this section before we step on?
What do you think about the phrase that we may share in his holiness?
Oh, there is we haven't gone into this too deeply because I think I've shared earlier, I struggle with it a little bit. But there is in Hebrews a discussion about the sort of progressive, both of Jesus, but that's the bit that's a little more frustrating,
yeah, it's hard to understand.
Is there a verb form of consternation? Is there a verbal form of consternation?
Consternating? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds a little too biological, I think. But yeah, so I think, and this is so all of this is related to some of this other language that I've shared also. I just, which is, there's an implication, as Mac was just referring to, of falling away, right? And losing the faith and stepping away, whether that's losing or, which again seems a more passive kind of action, or really what he's talking about is stepping away from the faith. He is exhorting us again that for they disciplined us for a short time as seemed best to them. Our parents did this, but our parents' discipline is flawed. That's what's implicit in that clause. But God disciplines us for our good in order that we may share in his holiness. And so he's saying God is drawing us, he's perfecting us even now so that we can more fully share in God's holiness. And I think this is one of these areas pastorally, which I say, being very conscious of the fact that I was only technically a pastor for 9 months, and Mac for an entire career, and others of you as friends probably even more so than me. But there are so many things, and pragmatically speaking, with so many people that I engage with, who they seek to be better Christians. They seek to grow into that holiness, but then there's certain things that they want to hold on to, and certain things that they will, argue, well, yeah, the Bible might have said it was a sin, but it's not, and so forth and so on. This is an area that I think, God is going to take us no matter how flawed we are. There is actually a now debunked comedian from Kentucky, actually, Christian comedian named Mike Warnke from the 80s. He claimed he was a Satan worshiper and everything, and it was all debunked. But he had a phrase I loved. He said, "You don't take a shower to take a bath. God's going to take us as dirty as we are. Even if it's just that last second, God's going to take us. I feel confident of that. But that doesn't mean that God wants us to stay there." And a better example, perhaps, is at the church where I was interim, we had a couple of staff members who were really broken. And I mean that very much in that sense. Things had happened to them that caused great hurt and grief to them. But they now acted out of that, and they knew that. But when I started working with them to try and get them to move from that self-destructive behavior to seek counseling from people better qualified than me to do that kind of work and so forth and so on, their comment was that the prior rector, he promised us this was a safe place, that we could come to this congregation and we would be safe. And I said, "You are, but that doesn't mean you should stay the way you are." And I wrote a little piece reflecting on it a year or so later about, and etymologically they're the same terms, but today we use the term hospice and hospital in two very different ways, right? Is the church to be a hospice? Because God absolutely will take us in no matter how ill we are with sin. But a hospice is a place where there's not much more that can be done. You're just there to be loved and cared for in those last moments when there's nothing else to be done. Or are we a hospital? Which I would argue that the church, militant as it were, the active living church right now, that's our active role, is yes, absolutely come wounded, dying, in pain, and you will be safe. But but you also are to go about being healed. And that's what I would view as growing into the holiness that God's called us to. We are to be a holy priesthood, a royal nation, right? And so it is one of these things that is not very popular to write or preach about, but I do feel that in general, American sort of progressive Christianity, as progressive as we've become, we've also become very regressive when it comes to understanding the health and growth and life that comes through, is supposed to come through following Jesus. Does any of that make sense? I got preachy there. I apologize. That's not what this is about.
No, I like that. I keep on thinking about that phrase, that to share in his holiness, and how it could be related to Paul's writings on kind of the exchange of Christ. Christ gives us, well, he takes our sin upon him and gives and exchanges that for his own righteousness and holiness, and that this might be part of that same process.
And isn't it, well, now it's well, I'd like to say it's sleep deprivation, but I probably wouldn't know it either way. But isn't it in Hebrews where it talks about that we are further perfecting the work of Jesus through what we do? Is that, yeah,
yes,
I thought it was. So similar, yeah, sharing, participating in his holiness. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I just talked a lot. I think didn't say anything better than you did. You said it first. So there's that image of being disciplined, but then what we do with it. And so there's that action component. I think what I would emphasize if I were preaching this, I think on one level one point would be that it's not just about discipline, but we really need to get behind it, and that it's about the relationship. That the reason all of that discipline, it's good for you, but what is truly remarkable is it's a sign of the fact that God is viewing us as his children and therefore cares enough to discipline us. I think that's the heart of the encouragement. So then we get perseverance, this effort, pursue peace with everyone and the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it, and there's again that language that feels a little strong to me. The holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and through it many become defiled. And here now the preacher can't help himself. One more time he's going to swing back around, and I tell you, if I preach this sermon, my wife would sit there and say, you've got like 14 different points and you repeat half of them 3 times each. It's just too much. Pick 2 or 3 points, focus on them and move on. And she'd be right. But we're getting ready to go back, of course, into ancient Israelite history to make his point. And again, there's this tension or this continuum. Maybe one of the ways we really are to understand this is relationship. But that's, the holiness without which no one will see the Lord, but then see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, like somehow we can do it for others, which I don't think is what he's really saying, but he's saying you do this in community. So remain in community, pursuing peace with everyone. But it's really about, he's hinting at division, not hinting at, he's getting at division, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble. And through it, many become defiled. And so he's going to go to Isaac and Esau. And of course, eponymously, this is where so much of ancient Israelite, the classic enemies, the Esau and then the descendants, the Edomites, and then later on down, even in the medieval period, it's interesting, the Edomites, so descended from Esau, are understood as it's not understood, but it's the terminology cryptically used from everybody from Christians to Romans to the advancing Muslims in the 8th and 9th century texts. So the descendants of Esau, this bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and through it many become defiled. So he's going right back to the greatest fissure or branching of the tree. See that no one becomes like Esau. Now I gotta say, there are a couple of moments in Hebrews where I'm like, hi, Esau, an immoral and godless person who sold his birthright for a meal. It's scripture. Hebrews is, but when I read Genesis, I don't see Esau as immoral and godless. I see him as a very simple person. Jacob, on the other hand, is conniving. He's a thief. He's a usurper. That's what his name means, according to Genesis. So anyway, maybe that's too much of an Old Testament scholar criticism coming out.
I agree with you. I would react to Jacob. I think how could he be so honored by God when he did all this? His mother too, for that matter.
Yeah. Have we talked about?
Esau wasn't such a great character, and really, I mean, this picture about him selling his birthright. I mean, I think I'm rereading Genesis right now, so I just read that again, and he kind of understood. I mean, it was like he couldn't take the long look, which is what Hebrews is asking us to do. He wanted a meal and wanted it right then, and he didn't weigh the consequences that he was actually turning over something that he certainly had to have understood. He had a birthright as the firstborn.
I agree with what you're saying, right? And Genesis uses the phrase we usually translate as he despised his birthright. And so he despised his birthright for lentil stew.
Yes.
And yes, but I don't see that sort of frivolousness, this immediacy. I see that as immature, selfish, self-serving. I mean, and those things we could see as immoral and godless, but Yeah, I mean, it's just, I won't quibble about it, but I mean, yeah, I'm not, but so I'm not trying to exonerate Esau at all, right? That's part of the point of the whole thing. In fact, really, the point is this is exacerbated because Isaac is playing favorites. Esau is Isaac's favorite. And that's what leads to this difficulty.
Yes.
Jacob was his mother's favorite, so she helps him connive. And then I'll just digress here because I think this is really important. I don't think it made it into the book because I had a whole like 20 some pages and she had me cut it out. That, you know, the consequences of sin. So suffering and struggling can come through families, not necessarily because God said Jacob sinned, therefore Joseph suffers, but the examples that go through. So Isaac set the stage by showing favoritism. And then, of course, Jacob cheats his brother and his father. And then we get this lovely little refrain that when he's with his who becomes his father-in-law, his uncle, what he did was known. We do not do here. We do not give the younger before the elder, and so that's how he ends up with both of the sisters. But here's the thing: remember Joseph? How did Joseph's brothers tell his father? Have I told you all this before? Anyway, how does Joseph's brothers tell Jacob that Joseph has died? What do they use? Do you remember this?
They use like blood. They kill an animal and put the blood on the coat and take it and say he must have succumbed to a wild animal.
They kill a goat. They put the goat's blood on his clothes, on their brother's clothes, and say that he was slaughtered by a wild animal. How did Jacob deceive his dad into getting the blessing? They killed a goat,
Took a
made
goat and
made stew, took the goat's skin and put his brother's clothes on to deceive dad. In other words,
wow, I never thought of
Jacob's
that.
deception was used by his own sons to deceive him, right? So this is what Hebrews is referring to, right? This is what the preacher is referring to. You let this get going, and I'll be honest, because he'll never watch this video, I don't think. But you know, my brother and I, we've got some strained relations, and one of the things that I think really frustrates him is I'm not interested in pursuing the strained aspect of the relations, right? So things will come up. You know, Mom was asking, we were talking about some of the more valuable things that she has and what will happen when she passes on. And she was saying, well, I think your brother's going to fight with you over, your brother thinks you'll fight over this. And I'm like, I don't need any of it. That's not something I want to fight over, right? Which is not to say I'm not perfect. There are other things I fight over, and I know I shouldn't. I should let him go. I'm not innocent in this relationship. But it's that sort of thing that he's saying within community. You know, Mac's reminder that he's preaching to a congregation or a community that is looking to fall away. And when do we see division grow up? When pressures most come, right? And that division can lead to nations warring against each other.
Yeah.
All right. So here's the wrapping up. I know we're at the end of our time. Actually, I've got two more slides. Be very quick. Well, summarizes this. You know, this is where we get this language that is evocative of Ezekiel and other prophetic texts, but also is very similar to what we find in Revelation. But look at verse 18. You have not come to something that can be touched, a blazing fire and a darkness, a gloom and a tempest, and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that not another word be spoken to them. He's talking about Moses receiving the word on the mountain. So again, we're talking about a new law. And he's saying they all went to that mountain. They all heard the thunder, the earthquake, they felt it, they saw the lightning, and it was so terrifying a sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. That's not where we are. We have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. I mean, he doesn't care the fact that he's mixing his metaphors together. His images are just all together. And to innumerable angels in festal gathering. Amy, here's your feast with wine.
Mhm.
And to the assembly, the congregation of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven. These are our cloud of witnesses, right? These are the saints, those who've gone before. And to God, the judge of all. The day of judgment is still really important.
Mhm.
And to the spirits of the righteous made perfect. And to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks of a better word than the blood of Abel. So it goes all the way back to that first killing. And so he is, I mean, go back to this question of how do we understand this in a way that's not supersessionist or not diminishing. It is certainly to be understanding that this is apocalyptic. I mean, in the sense that this is revelatory of God drawing all things together. Those earlier things were images, were signposts, were guiding us to this now fulfillment in Jesus, that perfecter of our faith.
Wow.
You know, the role of mediator,
Mhm.
still there, still important, because we're still here. We're still walking through this. So there's a lot there. I know we're coming towards the end of our time, but thoughts on this? So we're rounding out here because the next chapter is largely closing up, and so the preacher has now come to his crescendo. He's showing how we're part of this Heilsgeschichte. We're part of this holy history of God, going all the way back to creation, Cain and Abel, through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the Mount Sinai, all the and the law that was given. And that is then all of this becomes perfected through Jesus. So do not refuse the one who is speaking. And then he goes back to the mountain. They didn't escape when they heard it and so forth and so on. But we are hearing it going back to chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Hebrews, right? Who are we hearing this from? None other than the Son of God. This phrase, therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us give thanks by which we offer to God an acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for indeed our God is a consuming fire. So it's a little bit, it's not the tightest argument you might ever find. I don't know what a homiletics professor would make of it, to be honest. Like I said, my wife, who teaches speech, if you didn't catch that part, Elizabeth teaches speech at Penn State. There's a lot going on here. Theologically, he's got lots of different images that come in here, mountains and fires and the New Jerusalem. And then so many of these phrases that come down to us in our lectionary, in our liturgy. God is a consuming fire.
Mhm.
Any closing thoughts?
I think of that consuming word as like cleansing. You know, he consumes the dross and
The refiner's
polishes
fire.
what's left. Mhm. So we're meeting next week and finishing.
So next week we'll round it out. So, you know, it really is a very apocalyptic work,
Mhm.
but in the sense that we tend not to think of apocalypticism, which is it is a work of exhortation and encouragement, saying that it is it's not that the world is coming to an end, but it is all coming to fruition. And I love the invocation of the prophet that Hebrews does as well. One of my favorite little word plays. For as long as it is today, heed the word, because it will always be today.
Mhm.
Well, very good. Blessings and peace to you all. And I will see you next week.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.